You might think Ant-Man and the Wasp is a comedy about Scott Lang helping Hank and Hope rescue Janet Van Dyne from the quantum realm, but in reality, it's a movie all about microeconomic forces. Don't believe me? Let's start at the beginning. Welcome everyone, I am the Ecomicus Greg, where learning economics is as easy as watching a movie. And spoilers ahead for Ant-Man and the Wasp. First, a quick recap. After the events of Captain America's Civil War, Scott Lang is under house arrest and Hope and Hank are on the run from the FBI. After unknowingly making a psychic connection with Janet Van Dyne, Scott Lang is recruited by Hank and Hope to try and rescue her. They try to buy some much needed quantum tech from Sonny Birch for Hank's now shrunken lab. After the buy goes south, Hope tries to fight her way out of it, but the lab is actually stolen by an ex-SHIELD agent named Ghost. Hank, Hope, and Scott reach out to a fellow scientist and former Hank colleague Bill Foster for his help. After Foster helps them locate the lab, he betrays them, showing that he's actually an ally of Ghost. Ghost needs this technology in order to live, and after Bill Foster asks Hank to help, he refuses, believing that by saving Ghost, he would kill Janet. The three end up escaping with the lab, but then Scott rushes back home because he needs to stay there in case the FBI just happens to be there. Sonny Birch, on the other hand, is able to get the location of the lab because he interrogates some of Scott's friends. Sonny Birch gives the location to a corrupt FBI informant in his pocket, and they go and arrest Hank and Hope. Sonny Birch uses that distraction to take the lab for himself. Scott hears about this and he breaks Hank and Hope out of their jail cell, very similar to how Hank was able to take Scott out of the interrogation room in the first movie. They get the lab back, but now we have a complete, utter chase scene with this lab being the object everybody wants. Sonny Birch is eventually arrested during this time, and Hank actually uses the lab to go back and rescue Janet before Ghost can stop them. Janet comes back and she uses some of the quantum energy that she has to save Ghost, because apparently that's a thing. Scott rushes back home, tricking the FBI into believing that he's been there the whole time, and he is released from house arrest. Now, every character's motivations in this movie has actually been driven by microeconomics. And how do we know that? Well, we know that there's an economy already established in this simply by one of the first scenes where Hope is trying to buy the tech from Sonny Birch. Because now suddenly we have a scarce resource, which is the tech and the lab, and this movie is trying to decide who gets to have those resources. Therefore, we have an economy right off the bat. And if you want to understand the motivations, you need to understand this graph. And this graph is all about supply and demand, which is probably something you've heard of before. Simply put, law of supply and demand says that if there is more demand for a good than a supply, then the price goes up. If there is more supply than a demand of a good, then the price goes down. But let's get back to this transaction between Hope and Sonny. That's also a microeconomic idea called market mechanisms. Basically, it's the idea of exchanging currency for goods. Unfortunately, this market mechanism fails because Sonny decides to renege on the exchange. So in this case, the good is the lab that everybody wants, and all of a sudden now, Sonny wants this technology and the lab for himself. And now the demand for the lab has gone up. And it's gone up so much, and there's only one lab that now they decide that what's the price to pay for the lab? Well, it's basically exchanging fists and breaking the law. And so what happens when Ghost gets in? Well, you guessed it, the demand goes up, and therefore the price goes up, and everybody is even more desperate to try and get this lab. Ghost even suggests killing off Scott Lang's daughter in order to get the lab. And that brings us to Scott, who is a little bit different. In fact, he doesn't value the lab as much as the others. He actually values spending time with his daughter more so. And in economics, when you have another party, business, or individual who values a good differently than others, then we call this relative pricing. And so what would the law of relative pricing say? The law of relative pricing would say, well, Scott might not be willing to kill anybody for this lab, so he's probably going to act differently than others. And he does, because he values his daughter more. He's going to abandon Hank and Hope once he thinks that the whole mission is done. And the final chase scene actually also has more elements of microeconomics in there. In fact, when Sonny Birch gets arrested, that changes a lot of things. So now we actually have taken out one of these individuals who really want the lab. And what happens when you take one of these parties out? Well, guess what happens to the demand? It actually goes down. And so now you only have a few different parties, Hank, Hope, and Ghost, who all just want the lab for the same reason. And the thing is what's interesting about this is Sonny Birch's, exit out of the market isn't because it was someone else's fault. It was because he made some pretty stupid actions himself. For one, letting Scott's friends go free, and they're the ones that end up, bringing him in the end. And because of Sonny Birch's problems and the things that he set up led to him being taken out of the market, And because that led to a lower demand, that is an example of market failure, when a particular company or party ends up making some mistakes and then the value of a good goes down. So this thing that Ghost has really wanted forever, it actually gets solved by Janet Van Dyne's Deus Ex Machina powers now when she heals her. And with Ghost now getting what she wants, she no longer wants the lab either. And so then the demand falls even farther. And it goes down even more because Hank and Hope, they don't want the lab nearly as much now that Janet has been rescued. Now that you have a basic idea of some of the forces in microeconomics, it's time to dive more into the law of supply and demand. So be sure to check out my video about supply and demand and what that has to do with Black Panther in my video coming out next week on your way to becoming an economicist.